Hey guys, interesting day, right? We lose our first period, which really is the only period I really needed to teach today, but unfortunately we still have to learn the content. And so what I did is I just made a video of today's lecture or what today's lecture would have been. So please take a few minutes to listen and go through it. Please jot down any questions you have, and we can certainly address those on Friday when I see you again. But for now, we're just going to go through what we were going to cover in class today. Okay, we'll start with this big essential understanding piece that agriculture has changed over time because of cultural diffusion. Oh, just kidding. Got to turn my pen on. Because of cultural diffusion and advances in technology. So as cultures shift and spread and assimilate with other cultures, and as technology advances, that obviously both of those things are going to affect how we do agriculture and the types of agriculture and the yields of agriculture and all of that good stuff. So today, that is what our focus is going to be, is how agriculture has changed because of the diffusion of various cultures and the advances in technology. So there, that's just our section heading. Okay, agriculture origins and diffusion. Agriculture has changed over time because of cultural diffusion and advances in technology. Again, all right. So let's talk about hearths. You may have heard this term apply to like the hearth of a fireplace. The hearth is sort of the warm area around the base of a fireplace. They became extremely important during sort of olden days type of situation, right? It would help heat the home. It was usually some sort of stone or tile that was on the hearth. They were warm. People would put things there to dry. Women would put things there to bake, stuff like that. So, but a hearth in that sort of situation is basically considered the center of the home. Hearth in what we're talking about is essentially the center or the starting place of a specific agriculture style or system, okay? So early hearths of domestication of plants and animals include the Fertile Crescent, the Indus River Valley, Southeast Asia, and Central America. Okay, so those are the 4 hearths we're going to discuss. You'll notice these are all the center of great civilizations. So the Fertile Crescent is where we have Mesopotamia. The Indus River Valley had the Indus River Valley civilization. Southeast Asia is where you're going to find much of China, Korea, right? And then Central America, this is your big 3 of Central American civilizations. So that would be the Aztecs, Inca, Mayas. Specifically the Aztecs and the Mayas in Central America. The Incas were further south. But these are, it's no accident that you have some of the greatest civilizations in history also associated with this early domestication of plants and animals. Obviously, your civilization can't grow, your population can't grow unless you have a stable food source. And so once they figured out how to domesticate and grow crops, over and over in a very dependable, predictable way, they were able to expand their civilizations, expand the areas that they covered, as well as the number of people that they that were part of them. Okay, so they go hand in hand, obviously. All right, moving on. So the agricultural hearths, what we find is scientists agree that the planting of crops.
First lunch, begin dismissal.
The planting of crops and the domesticating of animals originated at multiple hearths around the world. So when we talk about this planting of crops and domesticating of animals, this is what is often referred to as the first agricultural revolution, or really where agriculture started. It was no longer just relying on what was in the woods or what was in the wild, hunting, that kind of thing. It actually was, we're going to make these plants and make these animals work for us and for the type of situation and living style that we have. And so we find this cultivating of crops and the domesticating of animals in lots of places. So the Fertile Crescent happened about 10,000 years ago. They planted barley, wheat, lentils, and olives. The domesticated largest number of animals that became helpful in agriculture. They domesticated pigs, sheep, cattle, and goats 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. They also domesticated dogs about 12,000 years ago. And the cultivation diffused west into Europe and east into Central Asia. So what we find in the Fertile Crescent is where Europe gets, how it spreads to Europe, okay? It comes from the Fertile Crescent. East Asia, 10,000 years ago, this is China. Obviously, rice is a big, super important crop in that region. Along the Yangtze River in China, millet also was cultivated along the Yellow River. Millet is similar to wheat. The Indus River Valley is like India area. Okay, so this is China. This is India. Sub-Saharan Africa, that makes sense. Latin America. Fertile Crescent, this is the Middle East. Present day Iraq. In the Indus River Valley civilization, about 4,000 years ago, they domesticated chickens. Horse was domesticated in Central Asia. The diffusion of horse and the diffusion of Indo-European language are thought to be associated, right? As things move and can move faster and farther thanks to the domestication of the horse, it takes the language with it. Sub-Saharan Africa, 8,000 years ago, sorghum, yams were both cultivated. Millet and rice cultivated independently of East Asia. Okay, so they both used millet and rice in both East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. But notice, very, very far apart, cultivated independently. This diffused to the rest of Africa. And then Latin America, there were two hearths in Latin America. The first is thought to be in Mexico, where they cultivated beans and cotton. And then the second is thought to be further south in Peru, where they cultivated potatoes. Maize, or what we know of as corn, was the most important crop from the region because it's high in nutrients, but it's also high in fat. And so it was great for feeding your animals as well as feeding yourself. Most important crop of the region may have been domesticated in both hearths independently. It diffused north into the United States and south to the tropical areas of South America. Squash also was possibly cultivated in Southeast United States. So lots and lots and lots of details. You don't necessarily need to know that chickens were cultivated 4,000 years ago in the Indus River Valley civilization, but it is important for you to be able to identify these hearths as well as understand where these hearths diffused. So the Fertile Crescent diffused to Europe, Latin America diffused to the US, okay? The Indus River Valley civilization would have been Central Asia. East Asia would have been through China as well as down into Southeast Asia and probably up into Eastern Russia as well. Okay, so just keep in mind, be able to associate the hearth with the civilizations as well as the hearth with where they diffused. All right, this is just a map of that same thing, seeing where things started, which is the green bubbles, and then where they diffused to with the red arrows. Diffusion is assisted, as we've talked about before, with transportation, right? If you have transportation, boats or trains or wagons or horses or whatever, your diffusion is likely to happen further, right? So there was something called the Columbian Exchange. Um, Basically, the Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus, by the way, it was a widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technologies, diseases, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World meaning Europe, in the 15th and 16th centuries. This was sort of the first, or kind of the beginning of the globalization of food products. I remember there's a movie, if you guys have ever seen the movie Ever After, it's about, oh gosh, it's old. It's probably 20 years old at least. But it's good. It's excellent, actually. Um, it's a fairy tale. It's kind of a live action Cinderella story. But there's a scene in this movie where the prince is walking with some of his admirers and he offers one of them chocolate. And, it's set in Great Britain, it's set in England, and they had never had chocolate before. And he talks about, the prince in the movie talks about how they got the chocolate from Spain. Well, chocolate comes from South America and comes from Africa. And so I thought that was just kind of an interesting little nod to this idea of the Columbian Exchange. Medieval times, the transfer of goods that aren't available in England from other places where they are. Okay, so just the movement of all of these different things kind of starts with this Columbian Exchange in the 15th and 16th centuries, which is the 14 and 1500s, by the way. So it's just interesting to think about that this trade of goods and technologies and things that are native somewhere but aren't native elsewhere was going on long before the technology that we think of when we associate, shipping and trade and stuff like that. Right, moving on. Second agricultural revolution. So we talked about the first one. The first one is that original cultivation of crops with the hearths. The second agricultural revolution, you don't need to do that. So here's just the review. The first agricultural revolution is when the people started harvesting seeds and planting and cultivating their own crops. The second agricultural revolution is when knowledge and technology advancements improved farming techniques and capabilities, resulting in higher crop yields. With this, you're also going to find new technology, which is often the result of new machination or building machines to help with the business of agriculture, right? Plows and tractors and combines, cotton gin, stuff like that. All of these new advancements are associated with the second agricultural revolution because it's a lot easier to plant more crops when it isn't just manpower that's harvesting them, right? And it's a lot easier to plant more crops when it isn't manpower that's hoeing and planting. You've got machines that can dig up your fields and till the ground, and then all you have to do is walk around and put seeds in the ground. That's a lot less labor intensive, and it means that one individual or one family can farm a much bigger area if they have access to this new tech. Okay. All right. So how are the industrial and agricultural revolutions linked? Now, we hear about the Industrial Revolution a lot. You study about it in history classes, but you maybe didn't hear much about the Agricultural Revolution. But they are associated, obviously. Crop yields per acre were increased by new knowledge about what techniques would allow plants to grow. Okay, using things like fertilizers, adding minerals to the soil content are all factors that are starting to be taken into account. People are studying them. Science is getting involved and interested and learning new things about how to better grow crops. New tools and new processes are developed to ensure that less people are needed to grow ever-increasing amounts of food. New plows, rakes, other implements began to be used, okay? So specific tools to a specific job. By the mid-1800s, farm machinery, such as the McCormick Reaper, which is a harvester tool, vastly increased the productivity of every farm worker. The enclosure movement, which is part of this second agricultural revolution, occurred throughout the 1700s in England, and which is where the common land was divided among local farmers and peasants. So basically, what used to just be a big field and anyone who wanted access to it could use it, people started to claim it as their own territory and enclose it, hence the name, with fences and gates and stuff like that. The land ended up being enclosed by fences. With private ownership of the land, it became far more productive because now people have, ownership and responsibility for this piece of land. It's mine. I'm going to make it work, as opposed to it just being up for grabs. All right, you don't need to do this. All right, the Green Revolution. So this is basically our agricultural revolution number 3. Okay, we've got the first one, which is the original cultivation of crops. We've got the second one, which is new methods and new technology. And now we have the third one, which is referred to as the Green Revolution. We're still talking about how agriculture has changed over time because of cultural diffusion and advances in technology. Green Revolution involved the practice of using higher yield seeds and expanded the use of fertilizers to increase production. The result is the increased use of chemical and mechanized farming. Chemical farming would be things like not just the higher yield seeds and fertilizers, but also things like pesticides as well. So positives and negatives. So for the positive side, more food. Yay, which meant you can feed more people and you make more money. The negatives, when you're involving things like pesticides and higher yield seeds, in some cases it's not that it's necessarily unproven science, but we don't know the long-term effects. Are there going to be side effects to consistently eating crops that are grown with these higher yield seeds that will negatively affect people's health? We don't know. Also, pesticides are not good for the water. So if you have pesticides that seep into the groundwater, that can be really detrimental to not just the crop, but to the people who are relying on that fresh water source. So there's a lot of downside in that sense, right? All right, moving on. So this is just a little bit more in depth on the Green Revolution. The invention and rapid diffusion of more productive agricultural techniques during the 1970s and 80s. Okay, so this is more recent. Introduction of higher yield seeds, miracle seeds of wheat, rice, and corn. Expanded use of fertilizer. So this takes us back to, it was Maslow, right? Who was like, the population is outgrowing our food source. We're eventually all going to have to starve, and there's going to be too many people that we can't feed, and blah, 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 blah. Well, the result, because of the Green Revolution, is that global agricultural productivity has increased faster than population growth. We do have enough food. We can feed everybody. Requirements of continuing the Green Revolution. So increased use of fertilizers, again, where you add in these minerals into the soil. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or potash is a kind of a slang term. Natural gas and/or petroleum are required for fertilizer production, which can become expensive. Okay, this is the source, energy source. When fossil fuel prices increase, limiting access to developing countries. So, this would be only available to developed countries. And the developing countries can't afford it. Phosphorus and potash reserves are not evenly distributed across Earth's surface. That says evening. It should say evenly across Earth's surface. So some people have more access to them than others, which could create, this will be like a supply and demand issue, which again goes back to money. Can you afford it if you don't have access to it? And if you can, you're probably living in a developed country. If you can't, then you're probably living in a developing country, and your lack of access to these new technologies is going to further hinder your ability to develop. The machinery is required to make the most effective use of these miracle seeds. So again, machinery is expensive. It costs money, which means it's going to be more likely found in developed countries and not developing. And there is environmental damage that needs to be taken into consideration. Irrigating, chemical use of fertilizers and pesticides, all of those things have a negative impact on the surrounding environment. And we're going to look at some pictures here in just a minute that will kind of point out what I mean by that. So the debate of the Green Revolution, the positives is that agriculture now outpaces population. Nitrogen-based fertilizers increase farm productivity. Scientists continue to invent new food sources. Higher productivity reduces dependency on imports in places such as China and India, where they have lots and lots of people they need to feed. Irrigation has increased crop yields. Agribusiness has increased the productivity of cash crops. We're going to talk about agribusiness later. Negatives. Poor countries can't afford the machinery. Not only can they not afford the machinery, they can't afford the fertilizer, they can't afford the fancy seeds, they can't afford all of the tools that are required to irrigate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Farmers in poor countries cannot afford fertilizers, which could lead to groundwater pollution. Overfishing, which basically means you don't allow the fish to repopulate. You fish too many of them out and then they can't recover. Or the ecosystem, the number of fish can't recover. In sub-Saharan Africa, the population is still growing faster than the food. Okay, so this is not everywhere. Irrigation has led to serious groundwater depletion. And then agribusiness means that land is devoted to raising one crop for money, not to feed the local population. Okay. Moving on to more essential understanding ideas is that the availability of resources and the cultural practices that are practiced in the region influence agricultural practices and land use patterns. So what you have available and the culture of the region both have an impact on how agriculture and land is used in that region. Right? Same idea. Okay, so we've looked at this before. This is basically the overview of where you find certain agricultural practices across the world. And it's extensive. If you look specifically at the United States, there are many. Because our land is so big and so varied, we have the opportunity to farm lots of different things in our own country. Other countries are not quite as blessed in the variance of climate and environment that we are. And so they're a little bit less, they just don't have the same kind of access or the same kind of opportunity that we do. So agricultural regions in the developing world, we've talked about these already, but now I want you to look at them as a region, okay? So pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, plantation, intensive subsistence, wet rice dominant, and then intensive subsistence, other crop dominant. So this basically means where you can't grow rice. There are certain regions of the world where the population is big and the need for food is great, but you don't have the right climate to grow rice. When you do have the right climate to grow rice, you grow rice, which is what you're going to find in East Asia and Southeast Asia. But other places like Central Asia or South Asia, you're going to find more other crop dominant. Okay, but these are all agricultural regions that you find in the developing world. Notice some are intensive, some are extensive, but being familiar with what they mean and where you're going to find them is important, especially being able to say, oh yeah, plantation, we find that in the developing world. We don't find that in the developed world. On the other side, agricultural regions in the developed world, same thing. Again, this is a review. We've been over this. Grain, Mediterranean, and commercial gardening and fruit are all developed world agricultural practices where the money comes from the crops. Again, some are extensive, some are intensive. And then dairy, ranching, and mixed crop and livestock is where the money comes from the animal products, not from the crops. Again, some dairying is intensive, and ranching and mixed crop and livestock are both extensive. Okay. So subsistence versus commercial. Again, we've gone over this. This should be review. Subsistence is where the production of food is primarily for the consumption of the farmer and his or her family. You find this in developing countries. Commercial farming is where the production of food is primarily for the sale off the farm. Okay, so it's to make money. It's not necessarily to feed your family. And that is what you're going to find in developed countries. 3 factors that distinguish subsistence from commercial, and these are things where you will need to know these because it will help you identify whether something is subsistence or commercial later if you're given that if you have to make that determination. So the first is the percentage of farmers in the labor force. If there are few, that means that you're going to find commercial, because few farmers mean lots of mechanization, lots of extensive fields, right? So one farmer can farm hundreds of acres of fields because of all of the mechanization. I don't know why I'm having a hard time with that word. Because of all of the mechanization that farmer has access to, plows and tractors and combines and all of those things. The use of machinery, the more machinery equals commercial, less machinery equals subsistence. Just like here, if you have many farmers, it equals subsistence. And then the size of the farm. If you guys were in front of me, I would ask you what you think, but small farms equals subsistence because you're relying on manpower, and one man or one family can only farm so much, right? Large farms equals commercial. Lots of mechanization. So the ability and the work of one person goes a lot further when you have a lot of machines that can work for you. Moving on. Agribusiness. Agribusiness is basically just commercial agriculture, characterized by the integration of different steps in the food processing industry. So think of it this way. So someone has to till the field and then plant the crops and then tend the crops and then harvest the crops. And then once those crops are harvested, let's say we're growing wheat. Okay, once that wheat is harvested, then that wheat now has to be sent to a processing plant where it's ground down and refined and bleached and made into flour. And then that flour is then taken somewhere else, and, you know, think of it as like a really large bakery where all kinds of additional ingredients are added, and that flour is made into bread. Well, that bread is now packaged and shipped and shows up on the store shelves at, your local supermarket.
Second lunch. Begin dismissal.
If you have all of those components from the time you plant until the shipping that takes your bread to the grocery store, all of those different steps along the way, if that's owned by the same company, then that's an agribusiness. Okay, does that make sense? What you may find instead is that you have lots of smaller companies that work sort of in tandem. So one company is the one that grows the wheat, the next company is the one that processes the wheat, and then the next company is the one that, makes the bread. And then there's another company that ships the bread, or that, takes the bread and ships it to the store. But more and more, especially in developing countries, especially in developed countries, you are going to find one company or one corporation in charge from the time things are planted until the time things end up on the store shelf. And that is an agribusiness, okay? It's usually through ownership by large corporations, generally found in developed countries, because you need corporations that are big enough and organized enough and have access to enough technology and enough mechanization to make that happen, okay? And you just don't find that in developing countries. All right, so let me introduce you to bid rent theory. So bid rent theory is basically what determines whether something is intensive or extensive. Which I know some of you are having a hard time figuring out what the difference is or what applies to what. It all is determined, but in part, by land cost, okay? So if I'm looking here at this graph, you will see the price and demand for land changes as it gets further away from market. Okay, so the distance away from market impacts how much the land costs. Now, tomatoes are generally sold close to market. Okay, let's say this is the market. So land costs a lot close to market. Land costs less for cattle, which is much further from market. But if you think about it, if I'm shipping cattle, I can ship them a lot further than I can tomatoes, because tomatoes go bad. Cattle, as long as I feed them, they can sit in the truck for days if I need them to. So it's all about maximizing profits. Being closer to market increases the potential for more customers, but it also means the land is more expensive. There's a trade-off between accessibility and cost of land. The more accessible, the more expensive, but you can also grow different types of crops that need refrigeration to be shipped or need to be shipped quickly to market. And you have much more access to potential customers. Okay, so it's a trade-off. It's always about where can I get that's closest enough to market where I can still maximize my profit, but far enough away where the land isn't, super expensive. All right, let's talk about von Thunen. Von Thunen. Oh, excuse me. So von Thunen is a model of agriculture that applies specifically to commercial farming. So von Thunen was a guy who realized that the purpose of commercial farming is to sell produce from the farm, making the distance from farm to market important, okay, and influential on the farmer's choice of what crops to plant. If it's going to be a long way from market, I can't plant crops that require or that won't last, right? That will go bad between the time I harvest them and the time I get them to market. The von Thunen model helps explain the importance of proximity, so how close you are, to market in the choice of crops on commercial farms. A commercial farmer initially considers which crops to cultivate and which animals to raise based on market location. So the farmer compares these two costs, the cost of the land and the cost of transportation, or transporting their goods to. So this is what von Thunen looks like. This is his assertion. So in the middle, the red is the middle, that's your city, that's your market. Surrounding your city is horticulture and dairying. So horticulture would be like commercial gardening, those fancy products. And dairying, obviously cows, cheese, milk, stuff like that, stuff that will spoil if it's left out. Around horticulture and dairying, that sort of darker green area, is forestry, most specifically because forestry is heavy. Cutting down trees and shipping them somewhere is going to be very expensive because of how heavy the product is. And so they need to be closer to market. Beyond that, the lighter green is crop rotation. Okay, so that's going to be where you rotate your crops between like soybeans and wheat and something else. I don't know, pick another one. After that is enclosed fields, then 3 fields, then grazing. Okay, so the first ring, market-oriented gardens and dairies. These products are perishable and expensive to deliver. The second ring is your woodlots where timber is cut for construction and fuel. Market proximity is important due to the weight of the product. The third ring is your mixed crops and pasture. Specific crops are rotated from year to year. And then the fourth ring is devoted exclusively to animal grazing, which requires space. Okay. So generally when you see von Thunen, this is the one you see. This is the von Thunen model adjusted if there's a water source running through it. Okay. So limitations of von Thunen. The model assumes that all land in a steady area had similar site characteristics and uniform quality, which obviously is not the case. Environmental, topographical specificities are always going to play a role. The model may vary depending on topographical features, like I just said. The model doesn't consider social customs, which may also influence the attractiveness of certain crops or livestock. And the model doesn't consider government policies, which may influence what people plant, or which livestock they decide to ranch. Okay. There are certainly government policies. For example, in the United States, for a long time, I don't think it's still the case, but for a long time, there were certain farmers that were being paid not to grow crops because the crops that they were growing were things that we didn't need. And if they flooded the market with all of this additional supply, that it would plunge the cost of that particular crop, which would put the entire market like into disarray, and people wouldn't be making enough money. And so the government actually paid farmers not to grow crops, certain crops. There are other policies in the United States where farmers were paid extra to grow certain crops, where there wasn't enough of something in the market and they wanted to encourage people, offer them some sort of stipend or incentive, right, to grow specific crops to help bring the cost of that crop down a little bit because it was too expensive. All right, last topic for the day, the global system of agriculture. So the availability of resources and cultural practices influence agricultural practices and land use patterns, okay? So remember the Columbian Exchange, right? That first initial setup where different things around the world were being traded to other places where they didn't have those same things. That has now skyrocketed. And so agriculture really is a global system. The fact that I can buy strawberries at the grocery store in February in Utah means for sure that those strawberries did not come from Utah. Normally they're going to come from somewhere in South America. But, if I'm buying strawberries from South America, what else am I buying and where else did it come from? So, things we need to know as it pertains to this section. Food and other agricultural products are part of a global supply chain, like my strawberries. Some countries have become highly dependent on one another, on one or more export commodities. So they're reliant on other countries buying specific things from them. And the main element of global food distribution networks are affected by political relationships, infrastructure, and the patterns of world trade. The political relationships one, I just want to put a big star on. If other countries around the world are not happy with you or your policies or certain things certain decisions you've made, they may choose to take their business elsewhere, which can certainly impact the economy of that country. Really, it could impact the economy of both countries if you go somewhere else and you're actually paying more. And then the original country lost a customer, right? So political relationships plays a much bigger role than people probably realize. So the global food trade. Food trading has increased rapidly in the 21st century. Again, it's because of technology. We can actually refrigerate stuff. We can refrigerate planes and fly it across the ocean. We can catch fish in the South China Sea and have it show up on my dinner plate here in Utah within 48 hours. That's crazy, but it's because of this impact of technology and transportation. 0.4 trillion in 2000. It was up to 1.3 trillion in 2012. I looked it up yesterday. We're somewhere around 1.5 today. Agricultural products move from the Western Hemisphere, so move from the U.S. and Latin America to the Eastern Hemisphere. So we go from west to east. Latin America, specifically Brazil and Argentina, is the main exporter of agricultural products. Now think about that. The United States is in the end of stage 3, moving into stage 4 of the demographic transition model, which means agriculture is not our primary export or primary economic activity anymore. We do farm in our country, but much of what we farm doesn't stay in our country. And much of what we eat isn't from our country. We actually import it from other countries because it's cheaper to do that than it is to use our land for farming. DTM tells us that as we move through the model, land is reallocated for different things. And if we don't need it for farming anymore because it's cheaper to buy stuff from developing countries like Brazil and Argentina, then we'll do that. Okay, the U.S. market share decreased from 19% in the 1970s to 11% in the 2000s. We're probably even lower now. Agricultural products have continued to increase rapidly, but other areas, specifically Latin America, have seen even more rapid increases. Developing countries, right, those that are still in that stage 2, maybe transitioning into stage 3 of DTM, have raised funds for expansion of agriculture through exporting fruits and vegetables that are out of season in developed countries. Hello, my strawberries. That's why they come from Mexico, because you can still grow strawberries in Mexico at this time of year. You can't grow strawberries in Utah in February. The developing country dilemma, though, is land is dedicated to exporting crops, right? So they're growing crops that don't stay in their country, that don't feed their citizens in order to raise money, right? Or do they use that land to make or to grow crops that do feed their citizens? Land dedicated for growing crops for domestic consumption or land dedicated to exporting crops to raise funds. That's going to be a balancing act that every developing country is going to have to figure out. If we look at supply and demand, the greatest food challenge in the 21st century is not supply. We have access. The greatest challenge is price. Food prices have doubled from 2006 to 2008. They remained at record highs through 2014, all because of poor weather, higher demand, especially in China and India as their populations continue to skyrocket. Smaller production growth, no new miracle breakthroughs recently. Use of crops as biofuels, right? We talk about ethanol, which is from corn, rather than fuel, especially in Latin America. Is biofuel more important than food? And the answer is, I don't know. Depends on who you talk to and who you ask, probably. It did drop sharply in 2015 due to increased supply. But there's still record high food prices also mean record high prices for prime agricultural land. So people want to farm, but finding land that will support agricultural endeavors means you're going to pay a lot of money for it. Sub-Saharan Africa is trying to match food supply with population growth, but they're struggling. Their population growth is crazy, right? We're still in stage 2 of DTM. So food production per capita hasn't changed a lot, but you also have to consider that there are other things at play in Africa. Lots of commercial farms, and those commercial farms tend to use the best land, and those commercial farms don't have crops go to the local residents. They have crops that go, for sale, to market worldwide. And so whatever land is left over, they can use to grow crops for local consumption, but that land is not great for doing that. And as a result, you get what you kind of see in the background of this slide, which is the killing of the land, over farming it to the point where you actually kill it. The threat of famine is always a concern, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where human activity, which I just talked about, is contributing to this harsh environmental conditions, which is what you see in the picture. All right, global supply chain. I like the graphic behind it because it kind of gives you an idea of how intricate and complicated the global supply chain is. But the main elements of global food distribution networks are affected by political relationships, infrastructure, and patterns of world trade. So all of those things are things that these agricultural companies and businesses and agribusinesses have to negotiate and sort of, figure out and navigate as we try to get food from planting to market, which is tricky. All right, this basically is just your process. So we start with technology supports for resource management. Okay, so we figure out how we're going to do this. Then this is for fishing. Okay, fishing. So we're figuring out how it is we're going to maintain this one, how it is we're going to maintain our supply. Then we produce it and we capture it. So we have fishermen that go out, we do aquaculture, which is basically exactly what it sounds like, agriculture except in the water, right? Where we have like fish farms and that kind of thing. And then aquaponics, where fish and vegetables are grown simultaneously, and the excrement from the fish actually go to fertilize the nutrients for the give nutrients to the plants and vice versa. It's pretty cool. If you ever have a chance to look into aquaponics, it's pretty fascinating. Then after we capture, right, after we have the resource in our possession, it goes to its first producer point. So somebody comes and carts them off the ship, weighs them. Then we go to value-added products, which is basically processing them, okay? Turning your tuna fish into tuna that goes in the can, right? That kind of thing, butchering them, etc. Recycle and make products from anything that you discard, things like cat food or other pet food, stuff like that. Then you have to distribute it, okay? Take it to market, plane, truck, etc. And then ultimately we sell it. It shows up on your plate at the restaurant, it shows up in the grocery store, or there are large scale buyers that buy them for big productions, okay? But it's, it's a multi-step process, and there's lots of things to consider and to navigate as we go from step to step. We're actually going to watch the production of chocolate is the case study that we do. That's when we do the taste test that goes with it. But you essentially see the issues with the production of chocolate and the processing of chocolate. Right, and then economies of scale. This is the Costco effect. So basically, an economy of scale is an economics term that describes a competitive advantage that larger entities have over smaller entities. Okay, so if I go to Costco and buy diapers, I'm buying a huge box of diapers. I think the box that we buy has 150 diapers in it, and it's like $45. Okay, if I go to Walmart and I spend $45 on diapers, I'll probably get about 100 diapers. But because Costco sells in a larger quantity, in bulk, right, that idea of buying in bulk is cheaper, then I get that kickback to me as a consumer. I know when I was, so I've coached lots of different sports here at North Star, girls volleyball, co-ed volleyball, girls basketball, and every time that I'm coaching, the kids always want to get like t-shirts or sweatsuits or something, right, to indicate that they made the team. And so I have had the opportunity to discuss and negotiate and purchase t-shirts or sweatshirts or something from various different sellers. And I always hear the same thing, right? If I buy more than 20, it's this price per unit. If I buy less than 20, it's a much higher price per unit, because there's a setup process, and that setup process is the same whether I'm buying one shirt or whether I'm buying 50 shirts. And so once that setup process is done and then I buy my one shirt, then it's going to be like $20. But if the setup process is $15 worth of work and then I buy 20 shirts, then I'm going to pay more overall, right? But the price per shirt is going to go from like $5 or $6 down to $2 or $3 per shirt. But it's because of this. It's this economies of scale idea that manufacturing costs can fall 70 to 90% every time the business doubles its output. So the more it makes, the less it costs to make it. So there's some internal and external factors. The internal would be the sheer size of the company allowing for bulk purchases. The external are receiving preferential treatment from government or other external sources. Diseconomies of scale can result if a company becomes less efficient, right? Where your price per unit continues to drop, but then for whatever reason there's efficiency issues and then it starts to creep back up, right? That's never what you want to see. You always want to see it going down. And then large shipping companies can use ships that carry as many goods as 16 freight trains. And so finding a place where you can actually use this economies of scale idea is important, because shipping matters, transportation matters. You have to get your product to market. All right, and that is where we are going to stop for today. Really, all you need to know about economies of scale is that the more someone produces, the less per item it costs to produce that. That's really just buying in bulk is cheaper, right? Producing in bulk is cheaper. And so it's kind of that idea. All right, that's it for today. Sorry, that was a lot. And this is what we would have done in class today. So please, please, please make sure you listen and watch and understand this video, and then we will pick up where we left off, or where we would have left off on Friday. So we will continue to follow the calendar that you guys already have access to. It's on Canvas. You also have hard copies. So just continue with that calendar. Nothing's being pushed back. This video will just replace what we would have done in class today. Okay? All right, guys, you're the best. Thank you, thank you.